I'm delighted to be here and delighted to present my book. So essentially, I will start by just giving an overview of the book. I hope in the time allotted I can talk about the whole book. So I can give you an idea of what I cover throughout the text. So essentially, I have two goals with this book. I wanted to talk about racial ideology and the state, how the state talks or doesn't talk about race and racism in Cuba, and then talk about how that then influences Black public opinion, racial attitudes on the ground. So I have this state component, and then I have this public opinion kind of agency, structure and agency component. And so essentially, you know, race ideology or racial ideology in Cuba is similar to the racial ideology we find throughout Latin America, what many term racial democracy. This idea that racism is not connected to structure, not connected to opportunities or access, that race is irrelevant as a social cleavage, often pointing to the United States as the example of what racism looks like, but always a denial about racism in that particular country. And so Cuba is no different. What makes Cuba unique is that it married this idea of socialism, right, or socialist revolution, with this denial of racism. And I argue that that makes it much more legitimate, right? And so I talk about that. And then, you know, it's important to note that this idea of this anti-racist ideology doesn't only work in capitalist settings, right? We know of it here in the United States as post-racialism, right? We all remember when Barack Obama was elected, racism ceased to exist here in the United States. You know, and again, it's racial democracy in Latin America. You know, but Cuba, you know, has been very effective in promoting this racial ideology in conjunction with socialism, because when Fidel Castro comes into power, he initiates desegregation. He opens up access to many employment avenues for blacks and for those of mixed race, particularly in education and in healthcare. 2 years after the revolution, he declares that racism has been solved. And so in this way, he's able to match a lot of his economic policies, right, and redistribution with this idea that once you do that, right, once you equalize salaries, once you open up access, that then ends this problem of racism. And so I'll talk about, you know, the effects of that, right, that policy. So the other part of this is Black public opinion and group consciousness. If we deny that racism exists, if we present the Cuban Revolution as this social revolution, particularly one that looks out for Black people and one that's interested in solving the problems of racial inequality, how then does that match up with the way that people perceive issues of racism and the policies of the Cuban government? And so I want to kind of challenge this idea that there are those that embrace the revolution and embrace what the revolution says about racism, and then there are those that completely reject it, right? There's a lot of gray area and nuance here, where even among those that are the most conscious, that are aware of the existence of racism, they still are influenced by this powerful ideology. Okay, so my model for the book looks like this. Essentially, what I'm looking at is racial ideology, and what the book does is create a model for why this racial democracy works so well. We have a lot of scholarship on racial democracy in Latin America and the way in which it undercuts Black consciousness by denying that racism is an issue and by kind of negating the importance of racial affirmation. But what I want to look at is why, right? Why? How does it do that? How does it make this negation of racism so believable? And how does it become so believable? And so I outline these three racial norms that the ideology has created, right? Antiracialism, this silence about race, and this conflation of prejudice and racism. And in doing that, I argue that this makes the issue of racism less salient, and even the importance of racial difference, which then keeps the racial status quo of inequality alive and well, and very sustainable. The other part of the model looks at these experiences of racism. And so in the book, I document the ways in which racist practices happen in Cuba, and how common experiences of racism are. And with that, you then have, right, this dissonance between racism doesn't exist, but here I am experiencing it, right? And so those experiences, create these counter ideologies, which then gives rise to this idea of Black consciousness or Black group identity, and that then is able to break the racial status quo if we can open up the dialogue in Cuba. So that's essentially the model of the book. The data I used, I created a survey of over 400 Black Cubans to look at Black public opinion by itself, which hadn't been done on the island. It's difficult to gather survey research in Cuba because there are so many limitations. Not many people weren't happy with what I was doing, and so there were difficulties in collecting that data. And then I also have interviews with 44 Cubans of different races to get an idea of white racial attitudes as well, and other opinions about the policies around racism and the dialogue around racism. Okay. So as I said, the first half of the book identifies these three norms that I talked about: silence, anti-racialism, and defining racism as this idea of prejudice or individual prejudice. And so the first I want to talk about is silence. So as I said, in 1961, Fidel Castro makes a speech and declares that racism has been solved. We've gotten rid of it, you're welcome, we don't have to talk about this anymore. But in effect, he legislates silence, right? Because it's removed from the public sphere. Before 1959, there was a vibrant Black press. There were Black organizations, Black social organizations. There was a lot of dialogue around issues of racism and racial inequality. All of that is banned. So he's not only silencing race in this way and silencing the Black voice, but at the same time, he's legislating this silence in that organizations are not allowed to form, right, in the future. Scholars are not permitted to write about this issue. Journalists are not permitted to write about this issue. And so in this way, the silence becomes part of, the formal, right, institutions. And it becomes entrenched, right? People stop talking about it as well. It's not only that the government stops talking about it, people stop talking about it as well. You're conditioned not to talk about the issue. As I said, it erased racism from public discourse. And then if you have an experience with racism, where do you go then to report it? Because essentially racism doesn't dissolve, but you don't have this channel through which to report such an instance. And so, the lack of policy to reverse these structural patterns, the lack of policy to recognize individual experiences, all of that is part of this national silence around racism. And so the idea was that, the government in, desegregating beaches, parks, perhaps many don't know that there was segregation, right, in Cuba. There were separate spaces in parks, there were separate spaces in beaches, social clubs. There were white social clubs, Black social clubs, mixed race social clubs. And so, in this practice of desegregation and opening up access, the idea was that this problem was solved without addressing it further. And so, a lot of what was left were the racist practices, the racist language, which I'll talk about in a moment. So a lot of my interviews, talked about this silence. I interviewed a young man from Santiago de Cuba, which is on the eastern part of the island. And so I asked him, did you talk about racism with your family? And he says, never ever, because my parents grew up that way. So it was reversed. I had to teach them. And at first they were defensive. They tried to accuse me of being a racist, which shows you what ignorance exists. There's a problem, but people don't see it. It's like the fish in the refrigerator. Its eyes are open, but it sees nothing because it's dead. That's how Cubans are with the issue of race. Racism is all over, inside your house, with your neighbor, at work, but Cubans can't see it. The society has always suffered from racism. That didn't end in '59 or at any other time. And so silence exists, but race is still everywhere, right? And even when I'm in Cuba, as I walk down the street, if people want to call out to me, what do they call me, right? They call me mulata, right? People are raced all of the time. There are, tons of racist expressions. This idea of, if somebody is misbehaving or acting loud or in a way that's inappropriate, and they're black, there's a famous or common saying that says, oh, he had to be black, right? It's a saying that everybody knows and everybody uses, right? There are phrases such as, if a black person is educated or, well-behaved, they say, oh, that's a blonde black, right? Un negro rubio, right, is the term. And so, race is everywhere, but nobody is necessarily talking about it or reflecting on, right, what is offensive, what, perpetuates this idea of black inferiority. And so, that's what I find when I go there. And that's what people experience as well. So the second norm is anti-racialism. And so anti-racialism essentially seeks to erase race as a social cleavage, right? Race is no longer important because we've solved this problem of racism. But the other part of this is that not only did race cease to be important according to the government, but then people were also absolved of their own racial attitudes, right? Because as you become a revolutionary, as you become this new man, right, modeled after Che Guevara and this idea of the new man in Cuba, being morally pure, right? That also absolves people of their racial attitudes. So if there's no racism, I also can't be racist, and then my language can't be racist either, right? And so, these kinds of sayings that I talked about, racial humor, language that denigrates blacks, becomes part of, the lexicon. And so I was at a beach, and I was leaving the beach, and I was getting into this, 1950 Chevy that's all over the island, right? And I get in, and the car won't start. And so the guy calls his friend over, to come fix it. And so, he opens the hood, and he starts to fix the car. And the driver, who's white, turns around and looks at me and smiles and says, see, that's how it works in Cuba. The white people drive, and the mulattoes do the fixing. And he thought it was hilarious. And I looked at him, and then I looked at my skin, and I said, well, what does he think I am? And when I told him that I was offended, he was completely taken aback, right? Because as he tells these jokes, right, he's never really challenged about, what they mean or who they're offending, right? And that's what I mean by this kind of lack of reflection about, what is racist and what is not. So in a way, we have this kind of double mechanism, right? Racism is relegated to these private spheres and private conversations, and sometimes even then, right, it's silenced. But also, it remains unchallenged in these private spheres, right? So racist practices and racist language survive. So racism is being shunned by the state, right, as not relevant, but it's also being protected, right, because it's not being challenged and it's not being addressed. And that's, part of why this ideology is so successful. So as part of the survey research, I asked, one of the questions I asked to the black respondents were, my social relations have a lot to do with the fact that I am black. And as we look at the results, we see that the majority of the sample disagreed or strongly disagreed with that, right? Race doesn't matter in my friendships. I'm friends with everybody. I don't have to think about race. And that's essentially the social norm, right? That's what's socially desirable to say. That's what people, automatically, it's kind of the knee-jerk response, right? Racism doesn't necessarily matter here. And that's the work of ideology. But when you ask a different kind of question, right? Many people do not consider blacks to be as efficient as whites. And then the second one, distrust. Many white people distrust or are suspicious in their relationship with blacks. You have the opposite response. Most people say, yes, right? There are these anti-black stereotypes or racial attitudes that exist. So how can both exist at the same time, right? How is it that I don't ever have to think about race in my relationships, but at the same time, right, white people are distrustful or suspicious of me or think that I am, right, less than. And so, there's a common saying, and one of my chapters in the book has this title, right? There's no racism here, right? And that's automatically what people would say when I would say I'm doing this, right, study about racism in Cuba. Oh, there's no racism here. And then as you keep asking, then you get a different story. And so that's why, the interviews in this study were so important, because a lot of the times, sometimes we could get, what we, some of the nuance, right, from the survey. But a lot of times, what I really found was that within the interviews, people would really say, what they meant. And so I asked this one woman, do you feel that racism exists here in Cuba? And so she said, no, I have many friends of color, some of my best friends are of color. I work with lots of people of color. There's no racism here. There are good people and there are black, bad people, and it doesn't matter if they're white or black, right? It's okay. I said, would you ever want your son to, or would it matter to you if your son married a black person? And she took a deep breath and she puts her hands on her chest and she says, I'm going to be honest with you. She said, I've always taught my children, that that the white people are the most precious and we have to protect them, right? And so, in this sense, you get that blanket answer, right? Racism doesn't exist. But then when you kind of move along, right, in that conversation, you get different answers. And a lot of times what I found is that that's the way that racism works in individual relationships. That people have many friendships, right? There are lots of interracial friendships and relationships. A lot of the neighborhoods, can be very diverse. But at the same time, when it comes to intimate relationships, that is where the line is drawn. And many of the people that talked about their own experiences with racism on the survey talked about this experience, right? Having to face a family who rejected them, right? Because they didn't want them to be dating their child. Another woman that I interviewed, I asked her about racism in her life. So she says, with friendship, there's no problem, at least in my case. I can have best friends that are black, but with respect to relations, that mix doesn't work for me, especially after my experience. I dated a black man just to test it, to see if it was in me, and I realized that it didn't fit. I was with a man of color. He smelled good, he was very friendly, he didn't have any black characteristics, and he treated me like a princess. But what I felt was disgust. I said, and had your parents taught you anything about race? And she said, my father always has this thing where white women look ugly with a black man, but he wasn't racist. And so I found that a lot of these family rules, right, existed within white families that defied this idea that social relations, right, are not based on race. But this is the way in which ideology kind of seeps into people's perceptions, but doesn't necessarily change practices, right? So let me see. So the next norm that I want to talk about is racism and prejudice. And this, I think, is one of the most successful tricks that racial democracy has pulled off. Defining structural racism or negating structural racism and replacing it with this idea that only individual prejudice exists, right? You might have, a family member who's racist, but this is an anomaly, right? And that racism doesn't necessarily affect people's life chances or opportunities. And this, I think, is particularly powerful when I talk about the way in which racial ideology really influences people's attitudes. And so, part of this is that even people that weren't necessarily part of the Communist Party or strong supporters of the revolution still insisted that Cuba was a supporter of racial equality, that this issue of racism was among individuals. And the revolution has been particularly powerful, in creating that idea without addressing, right, structural racism for the past almost 60 years. So 71% of the interviewees claimed that racism was not a part of the system. Particularly those that were highly in favor of the revolution also believed the party line, right? They believed that racism didn't exist. But even those that were not necessarily supporters of the revolution, I found also supported this party line to an extent, at least in the sense that, structural racism wasn't an issue. And so, this, so here's an interviewee that, he was a graduate student in history at the time. And so he said to me, children always have a role model to follow. They'll say, I want to be like this person. When you sit a black boy down in front of the television, who does he want to be like? There's no black person there, so what he will repeat are the same models that are in his neighborhood, which is often marginal. We don't have a Will Smith or a Denzel Washington. And look, at the end of the day, they're media figures, but you still feel represented. You can identify. That's important. So this issue of media came up often. People did recognize that the media was not representative, that black characters were not present in movies, in shows, on the news, and that was something that was recognized. But I found that other things, weren't attributed to systemic issues, right? Employment discrimination, racial profiling by the police. People didn't think about those things as systemic. Another person, so this interviewee was decidedly against the revolution, right? And so, I found that those that were against the revolution were far more likely to kind of denounce, the line about racism not existing. Right here in Cuba at the university, the percentage of students with those majors that lead to good jobs are white, and the majority of the university is white. And the central committee has like 4 or 5 blacks. Almeida, Lasso, the one from the unions, that's it, 3. On television, during political events or programs, they direct the camera to the few blacks that are present so they can come out on the television. Boom, 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 1, 2, 3, there, 3 blacks. And so there's this idea, right, that the propaganda is there, right? But, this particular response, was very different from most of the ones that I got. I talked to people who would say, employment discrimination exists, but it's individuals, right, that are discriminating against us. It's individual police that are discriminating against us. You don't find many black people that are working in the more lucrative jobs, but that's something with hiring, right? And so there wasn't this connection. So what we find in Cuba, and it's difficult, right, because there's very little data. It's hard to really, give concrete ways in which racism functions. I tried to do the best that I could with the book, and so I interviewed a lot of people. I went to, hotels and banks and places where, people are making the most money, right, the most kind of sought after jobs, and took tallies there, but it's very difficult to really identify. We can identify just from observation that blacks are still concentrated in marginal neighborhoods. That can be seen as a legacy of before the revolution, but also something that the revolution has not addressed. Blacks are seldom in high positions. They're often blocked out of certain sectors. They're seldom in managerial positions. What's different about Cuba is that once you have the fall of the Soviet Union, and the economic crisis hits in 1990 up until about 97, Cuba, and the revolution essentially transforms completely, right? The economic reforms that they have to put into place in order to stay afloat economically are the introduction of tourism, dollarization, the introduction of joint ventures to support tourism, and other ventures as well, self-employment, right? And so you have this kind of semi-capitalist reforms that are seeping into this socialist system. And what happens then is that those that are working in tourism and have access to hard currency and are getting tips from tourists and have access to the tourist industry are the best paid in Cuba, right? More than any doctor or engineer, right, or lawyer. And so with that, it then becomes lucrative to be in tourism. But what happens is blacks are shut out of that particular industry. The rationale is that European hotels don't want to hire black people. European tourists don't want to be greeted by black people, right, or served in restaurants by black people. And this is from interviews, right, that I did. But it's also part of the conventional wisdom, right, about why black people are not in these jobs. And so you start to see racism, more visibly. What the other part of this is that as tourists start coming into Cuba from Europe and Canada and Latin America, tourist spaces are now surveilled, right? They're protected. And so that leads to racial profiling by police, right? Black folks are stereotyped as being hustlers. Black women are stereotyped as being prostitutes because there's a resurgence of prostitution, right, and sex tourism once tourism comes back to Cuba. And so now you have more of these kind of everyday examples. It's not just the television. It's not just the lack of representation in government. Now I'm being stopped every day by the police officer. I've been stopped myself, right, if I'm walking with people that are visibly not from Cuba, because I've been mistaken as a Cuban. And so, I'm being stopped. I'm not allowed in this hotel. I'm being kicked out of this hotel. I'm being, stereotyped as a prostitute. I can't get a job in tourism. Or, I study tourism in college. I, graduate, and then they won't hire me, right? And all of these experiences start making racism much more visible. And so that's what I argue, builds this kind of network, right, of black solidarity and black consciousness, because now people are having different experiences than they used to. Representation is still not where it should be. There are a lot of debates about what representation should look like because the census undercounts black people. So, to make the argument that, representation should be at this, percentage is difficult. But nonetheless, right, it is lower than it should be. Raul Castro, when he took over for Fidel, did start putting in more people in the government, more women, more non-whites and younger people. But overall, it still remains low. As I said before, right, television roles usually have blacks in stereotypical roles. I interviewed one of the activists that's working on this issue, and he told me that he went to meet with a television station, and that he told the director of the station that he wanted to see more black people in more roles on television, and that the director said, what do we need more black people in television for? They already have their own channel, the sports channel, right? And this was kind of a serious, this is my response to you. And so, there isn't a push to kind of change this. The thing about Cuba is that television isn't controlled by the market, right? It doesn't matter who's watching. The state can put anything they want on television, and they do, right? And so it would be fairly easy for them to push a policy that would create a more diverse set of roles, set of programming, but they haven't done that. And then finally, the criminal justice issue, racial profiling by police. Also anecdotally, prisons are said to be, have a much higher percentage of blacks and mulattoes than that exists in the regular population. But we can't, get any data on that. So it's, what people have observed. And then there's the issue of the new economy. And so I'm actually working on this now and looking at how, as capitalism starts moving in and as economic reforms, start to be implemented first by Raul and now by the new president, Díaz-Canel, people are able to open small businesses. There are, more opportunities for self-employment. And how does that affect racial inequality? Because essentially, if you want to open your own business, you need startup money. And if you don't have access to hard currency, if you can't get one of these more lucrative jobs, if most of the Cubans that are here in the United States that are sending home remittances are white, then you have a clear disparity, right, between blacks and whites and access to hard currency. And so, how does that affect, black Cubans? And what I found is that many believe that the only way to advance economically is to leave, because the opportunities are not necessarily there to take advantage of a lot of the small business opportunities that are happening now, and they can't get jobs in the places where they need to. There's also a high percentage of black folks that are working in the informal economy, right? Sometimes that's legal, sometimes it's not, right? And so what happens is, as you legalize hard currency, as dollarization happened, these dollar stores started to open up. And now if you go to the store and you want to buy soap or shampoo or whatever it is, you're looking at prices very similar to those in the United States. The problem is that most people are making $20, $30, $40 a month. And so how do you purchase your necessities and then also, stay afloat? And so a lot of people have side hustles, right? They sell shoes out of their living room, right? Or they go to door selling, chicken or eggs that they got from the farmer's market and they're trying to make a profit on. And all of these things are illegal. They're necessary, right? But they're also illegal. And so if you don't have these legal channels available to you, a lot of times you'll find black folks have to do some of these other things, or work construction on the side, right? There are a million hustles that you couldn't even imagine that exist because, right, people need the extra money. And so if they can't do that, then, they think about immigration. The other side is if they do that, they're more likely to be arrested. And so that, perpetuates this issue. Okay. So as part of the survey, I asked people if they've had an experience with discrimination. And so, this data is extremely important because it's the first time we can really see not only how common experiences of discrimination are, but also what these experiences are. So after I asked them about whether they've had an experience, I then asked them to explain in an open question. And in that sense, I got a lot of rich detail about what kind of experiences people were having. So similar to US numbers, I found that 45% said that they had an experience with discrimination. Of those that said that they did, many of them had experiences that we might identify as structural racism. And then we have 77% that gave detailed responses about those experiences. And so what I found was that employment discrimination, racial profiling by police, mostly I found that black males were racially profiled by police. Stories about systemic racism, made up the majority of the answers, right? So structural racism exists. It's just that people are not processing it as such. And then 38% talked about social relations, either in relationships, in their family, on the street, right? Somebody said something racist to them on the street or on the bus. And so, that's essentially what we have. And so, what's important then is to think about, if people are having these experiences, and these are only people that have the experiences, right? Others have observed, right, and might not have experienced it themselves. If they're having these experiences, then how then do they think about their position in society? How do they think about what the revolution says about, right, racism? How do they think about Black consciousness, organizing, et cetera? And so, this is where, right, the dissonance occurs between the government rhetoric and what happens on the ground. So the second half of the book talks about this idea of locating Black consciousness. What does it look like? How do we theorize about it? And so I created these two separate dimensions, right? You have this formal critique of racism in Cuba, and so that's political activity and artistic expression. So there are small spaces of Black activism that exist, but they're bound by the state, right? So scholars have begun writing a little bit more about racism, but some of it, it's tempered, right? And so, for instance, somebody showed me that they had collected this data on people's experiences in the emerging sector, the self-employment and the tourism sector. And he couldn't share it with anyone. And he had to show it to me secretively because, he knew that they weren't going to publish the actual data. He was able to publish, the introduction, but not the actual data. And so publishing the introduction is a big step, right? From we're never going to talk about this again, in 61. But at the same time, it is bound by the state. HipHop is part of this also, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then what I really want to talk about, because we can all see what's happening in public, right? We can all look up journal articles. We can all, Google YouTube videos of a lot of the hip-hop groups, and we know what that looks like. But we don't necessarily know what's happening underground, right? And so I call this the informal critique of racism. And so, here what I want to do is, a lot of the literature on racial activism in Latin America and Black consciousness in Latin America looks at social movements, public activism, vote choice. And while all of those things are important, it misses, right, this other dimension of Black consciousness, which is people's discussions amongst each other, right? Collective networks of solidarity that are being formed. And we miss that piece, right, if we're only looking at this public activism side of things. And so, a lot of these kind of informal conversations reinforce ideas about what Blackness is, right, what racism is, how that fits into, the government, these kind of networks of information about race. And so a lot of the conversations that, we tend to have here are also happening in Cuba, right? But they're happening in private. And so, the informality of this kind of expression doesn't necessarily undercut its importance, right? Because this is part of Black political thought, particularly in Cuba where you don't have the freedom of association or the freedom of speech. And so this is really, the foundation of what would be, right, a movement if you had more freedoms. So when I asked Blacks in the survey, should Blacks organize, 60% said yes, right? So something is happening here where, people think that a Black organization would be useful. The other side of this is that when I asked a question about whether a Black organization or a Black civil rights organization would be exclusive in the same way that white nationalist organizations are, many people also said yes, right? 55%. So there's this contradiction where people feel as though blacks should be talking and organizing and dealing with this issue, but at the same time, there's also this, norm that exists because, right, of government rhetoric that says, but this would be divisive, right? At the start of the revolution, there was a women's organization that was created to fight, right, for gender equality. It still exists. It's one of the largest mass organizations on the island, but there was no such organization created for racial inequality. And the idea is that, we can fight for women's rights, but fighting for black rights goes against, right, the revolution in some way, right, or creates divisions that we don't want to see. Most of the interviewees felt that way as well, even though, right, there's this idea that blacks should organize. When I asked, questions about linked fate, when blacks, experience racism, this affects me as well, right, or my success is related to the success of other black people. I also found, right, 65% would say yes, right, they did have feelings of linked fate. They were personally affected by experiences of racism that other black people had. But I find that it's also, tempered by the power of this racial ideology, right? The power that the socialist revolution solved many of the problems of systemic racism. And essentially, when you think about racism only being among individuals, how do we kind of envision tackling that, right? You can't necessarily change people's minds. There's no policy that can change people's minds. I can't imagine a movement that would change people's minds. So racism becomes insurmountable in some kind of way, where organizing or policies, might not address them. And so that's part of this, this trick, right, with equating racism with individual prejudice. So I interviewed a woman living in Havana, and she said, we were so happy here in Cuba with Obama. Many other black people that are full of it weren't, but many, many were, because black people have a right to be president. I feel proud to have a black man in that position. It's very important. And the way he speaks, the way he acts, the man is marvelous. No one in the government talks about race because they say there is equality, but that's a lie. In the government, everyone is white and old already. When they die, I don't know what they're going to do. They're going to have to bring in old white people from who knows where. I get tired of it, so I laugh. And so this is what I mean about what happens on the ground, right? People are watching what's happening in the US. I opened up the book talking about the election of Barack Obama because I was there in 2008, and all I heard from people was the United States will never elect a black president. And so once there was a black president here in the US, people in Cuba started reflecting on that. If the US has done this, right, why hasn't Cuba, or why does Cuba's government look like it does? And so a lot of these conversations I found happening not only about Cuba, right, but also about racial politics in the US. And so there are some activist organizations that exist. The issue with activist organizations is that they're mostly made up of writers and scholars. It's a small group of people, right? I could say I know almost all of them. That's how small the group is. And so they're given a space by the government. They're given space to meet. They're given space to debate. But they are not given space to recruit, right, members. And so essentially they are, working with the government to try to change the curriculum, for instance, to include more black history or black contribution, trying to change, what's on television. But beyond that, they haven't been able to do very much. However, I will say that their presence is important, right? Because the state is listening. Even if they're not doing anything, they're listening. Academic publishing, as I said, has pointed to issues of racism. HipHop in particular, I think has been the key messenger of black consciousness to the general populace. And so in this sense, they have been given, a reach that's much longer than those that are working within these activist organizations, because they're performing on stage, right? Anyone can come to their shows. Anyone can buy their music. And so many of them see it as a commitment to try to, continue this dialogue about racial consciousness. The other part of this is that the state, because they're listening to these activist organizations, have tried to co-opt the movement. And so they've created their own organization called Comisión Aponte, which consists of those that continue to tote this kind of party line about racism being, only evident within this realm of individual prejudice. They do some workshops about, the importance of not being racist, but nothing that would get at real policy change, and nothing that really comes close to what some of these smaller organizations are doing. Their daily roundtable that is televised every day at 5:00 p.m. called Mesa Redonda is a kind of their meet the press, right? But filled with government officials who, don't give you necessarily a picture that, is different than the one that the government does. They've talked, I believe, 3 times about racism. And so in that sense, they're trying to, right, increase dialogue, but it stays within these limits of government rhetoric. And so, really what's happening here is that the state has missed this grand opportunity. The way in which, the system is set up in Cuba, there are many campaigns that have been put forth. A campaign against homophobia, which, I think a lot of people would not have predicted, considering a lot of the policies that the Cuban government had at the beginning of the revolution, jailing those who were homosexual, only for being homosexual. So they've had campaign against homophobia, they've had many campaigns against a lot of social ills that exist, but just will not tackle this issue of racism. And it matters because if people on the ground, particularly black folks on the ground, are talking about this issue, are reflecting on this issue, are talking about their experiences with racism, with police, right, within the tourism industry, and the government refuses to address it, they miss this opportunity to kind of gain back the black support that they had at the beginning of the revolution, which I find is no longer there, right? I mean, when I did this survey and I asked, how many want to leave Cuba, over half the sample said yes, they wanted to leave. And so in that sense, there's this disconnect, right, between what the government says and what happens. There's a disconnect in a lot of other issues as well, right, that the government talks about that doesn't match up with what happens on the ground. But I think in this particular instance, they would have been able to tackle this issue in a way that would gain support from a lot of people without a lot of kind of political risk. Essentially that is, where we stand today. The black organizations, though, are strong, and their opinions are strong. I interviewed a woman who was the founder of Color Cubano. This particular organization isn't around anymore, but she is still active in others. She said, you asked me what I want, and I know there are black people that agree with me. What I want is to empower. How are we going to organize the participation and the empowerment of the black population? The rest doesn't interest me. When I go to the Central Committee, I don't want the black person to be the one at the door or the one serving me tea. We have to empower each other because that is the only thing in the path towards community strength. Power won't be given to anyone. Another black activist stood up in the middle of a book presentation in Cuba at the Institute of Anthropology and said this: we are in the midst of a beginning of a black movement in Cuba. Our education must reflect that by presenting both parts of history, white and black. Our history is incomplete if only one part is taught in our schools. Our government must represent our black citizens as well. But I do not care about the number of blacks in government if these blacks do not think like blacks. If they are not conscious, then what is the point? If they think like whites, if they are Uncle Toms that wish to perpetuate white privilege and say that racism is no longer a problem, then I can do without that black representation in government. So these are the kinds of messages that, you know, a lot of the leaders are putting forth. But as I said, it hasn't yet led to, you know, real change. And then just lastly, the hip-hop movement, I think, has been extremely influential in creating these kinds of messages of black pride, reaching this larger audience. The government has given them a rap agency, right, where they receive funds to perform, they get visas to travel, they go on tour to Europe, the US. And so in this way, you know, they're able to kind of sustain their movement. Two of the groups in particular that talk about these issues are Obsession and 340MS. Obsession did a CD called the Black Disc, right, El Disco Negro, you see with the Afro pick. And the entire CD was dedicated to issues of race in Cuba. And so there are quite a few groups that see it as their mission to do that. When I was there in 2010, there was one of their videos actually came on state television, which, you know, to me, I found it by accident and I couldn't believe I was watching it. But it was one of their videos about the importance of embracing black hair, right? But that's something that you would never see on Cuban television, right? And so in that way, they're kind of opening up these doors a little bit. You know, Obsession in particular works very closely with the activists and a lot of the scholars that are working on anti-racist issues. And so in that sense, you know, they're all kind of connected in this way, trying to open up dialogue about racism. But I think, you know, the real story here is all of the kind of networks that exist underground, because it's a potential for a larger movement. And I think if, you know, that space were ever given, that we would see, you know, politics in Cuba that, you know, are very similar to Brazil, for example, right, where you have, you know, larger black organizations and movements, where you had the beginning of affirmative action, you know, in the late 90s. And so, you know, this is, I think, where a lot of the, you know, black political thought is being created. One of the ex-members of Obsession said about hip-hop and the role of hip-hop. There were people talking about the issue of racism before the rap movement, but what happened is that no one had ever said the things that the rap movement did in the way that we did, and no one had been as effective in communicating this issue. Now there are more people talking about the problem, mostly young people. When the exchange began with the hip-hop movement and the young people, it was like we were educating people, making them literate. And he, in fact, got interested in hip-hop because another artist actually gave him this book. I don't know how familiar you all are with Cuban history, but there's a book called Our Rightful Share by Eileen Haug, and it was actually, once it was translated, people started distributing it amongst themselves because there was no curriculum about black history in Cuba. And so people started educating themselves about that. The group then made a song about it, you know, that then reached a wider audience. You know, but in Cuba, you know, because information is difficult to access, because internet is not as accessible as it is in other places, these are the ways in which ideas are exchanged, right, kind of on the ground. And so that also kind of, you know, helps to build up this, the hip-hop movement and their, you know, and their lyrics and their content about black consciousness. So the future, I think, is obviously unknown, as it always is. But particularly because we're not sure yet what the new president, where he's going to come down on this issue. Raul Castro, as I said, did address the issue a bit more than Fidel did in, appointing more people to the national government, to the Central Committee that were black. He talked here and there about the issue of racism, keeping it within the framework of individual prejudice, but at least discussing it in ways that Fidel never did. I'm not sure if you remember when Barack Obama visited Havana, the very next day after Obama talked about both the United States and Cuba having to deal with this issue of of racial inequality, the very next day Fidel Castro wrote a letter saying, Barack Obama must not realize that we solved this problem of discrimination a long time ago. So Raul was different, right, when he was president. We will see, what this president does and how they respond to these activist circles. I think that will, be part of, where this goes as far as the above ground, right, critique. But I think, without this kind of opening of dialogue, without, real policy that addresses this issue, the status quo is likely to remain the same and possibly get worse as more people start opening up new businesses and, really kind of creating this middle class in Cuba where blacks are left out. And so in that sense, I think, the problem, is worsening as society changes, right? And as the economy changes, and the economy has to begin to adapt to not having now Venezuela as, an ally. And, as this happens, I think, we'll see that racial inequality becomes a bit worse. But I think the potential is there, right, for a larger dialogue. And the state, has this opportunity, right, as a socialist state to address, a lot of these issues, particularly in the media, within the government, with a real kind of focus on the issue of racism. But again, it remains to be seen. So thank you very much.